welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. This week, I'm joined by Beth a licensed marriage and family therapist in Santa Monica, California. Her expertise is tapping into the inner wisdom of the body to liberate its potential. She uses breathwork to balance the nervous system, to change and release old habitual holding patterns, and allow for a deeper, more authentic experience of the self. This builds new neural pathways that create a body sense of well-being, increasing joy, resilience, and aliveness that leads to deep and lasting transformation. At the heart of it, it's the core and the key to resilience. I had an incredible conversation with Beth. And so before we dive into the depths of this episode, I'd like just to mention briefly 3 key benefits you'll get from listening to this conversation I had with Beth. First, we dive deep into the idea of resilience, not just about the emotional aspect, but how it's connected to our bodies and our breath. Beth emphasizes how important it is to work with the body to build resilience, and she shares some really practical tools that you can start using right away. If you've ever felt stuck in survival mode, I think this part of the conversation you'll find really beneficial. The next key takeaway, I think, is when we talk about parenting and how our presence as parents plays a huge role in our kids' emotional development. Beth touches on how small misattunements, like when we're not present with our kids, listening or seeing them, how this can create confusion or even lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms. We also explore ways to avoid that and how showing up authentically and being present can make all the difference in raising resilient children. And finally, we get into self-attunement and managing stress. This part really hit home for me because Beth explains how understanding your inner fears and triggers is the key to better self-awareness. Plus, we talk about using breath as a tool for calming your nervous system and shifting out of stress. So if you're looking for simple and effective ways to manage stress and improve your emotional health, I want you to tune into this episode. I think it's going to hit home. So without further ado, let's slip into the stream and meet Beth Bardovi. Well, Beth, welcome to the show. I really appreciate that we could find this time to speak.
Thank you, Jason. It's really good to be here with you.
Perhaps we could kick off the conversation by you just briefly introducing who you are and what you do.
I've been a somatic psychotherapist for about 40 years now. And what that means is, in addition to emotions, I also work with the body, breath, and how our emotions live inside of us.
And I guess that's a really good spring off point because one of the major focuses on this podcast is resilience. And of course, a sense of well-being on top of that. Perhaps can we talk about, because through your readings, I've read that who we are today is highly influenced by the relationships we've had early in our life. I was wondering if we could maybe begin there and talk a little about that.
Sure. That's a really big question. So jump in anytime.
Yeah.
If I gotta go on a monologue here. We learn who we are as children based on the messages and the energetic responses from our parents, right? So each of us in human development learn outside in, which is kind of like what I was so struck about by the name of your podcast, because eventually we have to learn inside out, right? How to come from the inside and come out and show up. And if parents have the ability to really energetically be present and engage with their children, and reflect back who they are accurately, what matches a child's own inner experience, then it's like a child can land, I'm home, I'm felt, I'm known, I'm seen, I'm heard. And if that mirroring comes back inaccurately, if a child says, I feel sad, and the parent says, oh, what do you have? Like, what do you have to feel sad about? You don't feel sad. That child ends up feeling confused because it doesn't match their own experience. And so as children, then when we don't feel attuned, right? We develop coping mechanisms, protective mechanisms from what feels like either too much, not enough, or intolerable.
And, especially when a child, I think sometimes parents should have some sort of education or learnings or trainings in child rearing or bringing up children in the sense, that deeper sense, because I think many parents try their best, but there's sometimes a limited capacity to how they do it. And so they sincerely and genuinely try to parent the best that they can. But as you said, sometimes there's not that validation or alignment, because children will look up to their parents, obviously, and that provides the road signage that's, okay, mommy and daddy are probably right, and my own internal narrative or my own internal emotions are maybe not as important. I'm not saying that they articulate that, but I think it's that description you've talked about, how you articulate it, where it doesn't resonate or there's a misalignment. And then I guess, as you said, there are coping mechanisms that develop from that.
Yes, and I think it's important to say there's no such thing as a perfect parent, like right off the bat. And
Well
and our
said,
children, our children don't need us to be perfect, right? And I do agree with you. I think that most parents do the best they can. And what happens is, without like that own, like the education that you referred to, or getting a different level of understanding, all parents can do is parent either how they were parented or kind of like in a reaction to it, which is just the flip side of a coin. But neither of those come from authenticity when we're in reaction.
When we're in reaction.
Yeah. And children need their parents, right? Like, just to go to the other part that you said. And so children will doubt themselves when that misattunement happens because their parents must be right. Right? Parents for until somewhere in the teenage years are on a pedestal, and children really need them. So a child will make it be about them.
I was wondering, maybe you were talking about self-attunement. I was wondering if you could operationally define that, and maybe we could explore what that means at a deeper level.
Sure. Self-attunement is that ability to be able to tune in and to know what your own inner experience is. And then I would add on to also be able to have some compassion for when we're not at our best, right? And I think compassion isn't technically part of self-attunement, but I think it actually really is, from a compassionate place, to be able to know who we are.
And how can someone be better at self-awareness? Because obviously you need to stop in the moment, reflect on perhaps the narrative going through your head, or trying to understand the message that the emotions are trying to communicate to us, whether it's a false or an accurate message, but to receive that message. But how does someone from your experience train to become better at self-awareness so they can have better self-attunement?
I think in a way to simplify it, right? Like if we think of a river, right, and we're just kind of floating with the current in the center of the river, there's an ease, there's a flow, right?
Mm.
And so when we're in that state of flow, we're at our best. And to continue with this river analogy, if one side of the river has this fear of loss feeling to it,
Yeah.
and the other bank has a fear of feeling smothered or inundated, um, if we break down all of our, as humans, how we develop on a continuum, our injuries come either from that fear of loss, the not enough, or a fear of being smothered. And we can feel smothered even from love, right? So it's a way in. Oh, did something just happen that threw me off center that has to do with a fear of loss? Or did something happen and I'm feeling inundated, or I'm starting to feel like I don't have enough breathing room?
Overwhelmed or just
Overwhelmed, yeah.
so
Exactly.
just to explore these two banks of the river, this metaphorical river. So the fear of loss, is that also a fear of lack? The lack of attention, the lack of value, the lack of validation, the loss of someone or the loss of significance, or I was wondering, and the fear of being smothered, is that when we feel there's too much control or people are too much on us? I was wondering if maybe we could explore these, since they can be the injury to our psyche or to our mindset per se, these banks.
Yeah, exactly. That fear of loss, right? It can be, I mean, quite literally, if a parent gets sick, oh, seriously sick, right? Or dies. Those are easy fears of loss to see. But also, as you said, if a parent doesn't have enough bandwidth themselves or has, right, we can't always meet our child's needs. So if a child doesn't feel seen or heard accurately, that can feel like a loss. If a parent is physically present, but preoccupied with something that might be important to the parent, and the child is wanting to engage, and that parent comes from a more distracted energy, that child could possibly feel that fear of loss.
And so the fear of being smothered, as you said, that could be too much love, or that's could, when we're inundated with too much, it could, obviously that may be trauma, that might be a sense of control, or the lack of control, or losing our sense of agency or autonomy, maybe is a better way of articulating it.
And that exactly, and that can show up from the parent who always tells their child what to do and expects their child to follow through. One of my most striking experiences, I was speaking to a group of teenagers. One day, they were peer counselors at a high school. And I started talking about the inundation, and I said, if a parent has been trying to get pregnant for so long, and 5 years later they get pregnant, and they take this little baby and they say, I've been wanting this for so long, I'm never going to let you go. And a young man, a teenage boy, he said, I now understand my mom. And I could just feel like his whole nervous system calm with that aha of the feeling, knowing he was loved, but it never quite felt right because it just felt like too much for him.
It's amazing sometimes how one small little thing, one grain of insight can make everything kind of click and fall into place. And then there's this insight, then we can understand. That's why we can understand the drivers or the reasoning behind whatever situation or conundrum we're dealing with or what has happened to us. And it all of a sudden, it all makes kind of sense to some extent. I think that's a fabulous story. You're talking about this teenage boy.
Yeah, it's that power of when something doesn't land and we don't feel that tuned in, it becomes what I call like this incoherent narrative. But just as you said, like you get that aha and it clicks and you can see it. So it takes what the old pattern or the old beliefs and then makes it be a new coherent narrative. It wasn't me, right? And it makes sense. And then like that landing, landing into our body.
And so self-attunement, is this part of it? Is it understanding the banks of this metaphorical river, the fear of loss and the fear of being smothered or inundated?
It is. It's like knowing when we're in our flow and then knowing when we're not and which side of the river are we on, and then asking, how is what just happened the same as or similar or familiar to my childhood experience? And the same as is pretty self-explanatory. Similar, right? It's maybe an orange instead of an apple. But the familiar is the harder one to recognize. And that's the energetic aspect of it. So we talked about, I mentioned an example of a distracted parent, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody is having a conversation in current day and the person they're with kind of gives them like, I'm kind of listening energy, but not really here. That could trigger somebody who had a distracted parent. And it's that familiar energetic. And it's really recognizing and starting to be curious about what one's triggers are. Because each of us have different triggers. And we each have maybe a handful. Like there's not that many things that throw us off. And being able to know what they are and then how they land in our body. For some people, they can feel a tightening in their chest with a certain feeling. Some people might feel it in their stomach or other places, right? But we usually respond in our body before our brain catches up.
Yeah, it's a sense of embodied cognition. But if we could just rewind back, the distracted parent, for example. So you and I are having a conversation, but Jason seems distracted. He's, other things are occupying his attention. He's kind of there. And my behavior obviously may trigger something in you, reflecting back to a distracted parent. But that history for Beth, that wouldn't be so much like a one-off with that parent. It would have to be a pattern of behavior over a time, right? It would have to be over space and sort of temporal, in a sense. Is that what I understand? Because it's generally not a one-off thing. It's a pattern that plays in, which kind of marks that child's experience. And as he or she develops into an adult, that pattern becomes part of their rules of engagement or how they engage with the world, how they define the world. Is that what I understand?
Yes, and I would even deepen it a little bit more in that if you think about the first 3 years of life, right? And our brains aren't developed, or children's brains aren't developed at that point. So all of these patterns start as body experiences and body feelings. And it's not a one-off, right? But as that repeats, we attach a story to it. And so, I know for me, right, being seen and heard right, is really, that could be one of my triggers. So if I'm just slightly off and I start opening up to someone, okay, and I don't feel like I have their real attention, I could feel that old injury of that little girl who didn't feel seen or heard, which didn't come from bad intentioned parents. I think it came from being one of 4 kids in a family.
For sure.
But that feeling, right, it just creates such an aloneness inside, and I can land there. Or I can now, say, oh, okay, here she is, right? I understand. I see you. I hear what you're saying. And just do a little self-love in a sense, right? And calm myself and kind of get myself back into that center of the river again.
But I guess to even get to that point, to catch yourself in the moment and to show self-compassion and to see the pattern that you've fallen into, I mean, that in itself is a certain level of skill or a certain level of being cognizant to get there, because many of us can get caught up in that narrative and we can just go down the rabbit hole. And when we just follow it, we believe everything that our brains are communicating to us, the narrative or the meaning we've ascribed to the situation, which is based on some sort of past pattern. And then we get caught up in the emotions. The emotions rule us instead of us kind of ruling the emotions per se. I mean, how does someone get there? I mean, how can, I know this is not a simple question to answer, but how can we become more cognizant to recognize the banks of the metaphorical river and to learn from it and to evolve?
It is a big question. And I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of curiosity, like to simplify, like really what it takes. And sometimes it takes somebody else holding up that mirror, because what you're talking about happens is we just land in our old familiar, and that belief becomes true. And if we can start to pay attention to what we feel, what one feels in their body when they do feel triggered, or if somebody can step back and say, wow, I really overreacted. That's at any point when you can say that, then you can know whatever happened, most likely is a trigger of something familiar, similar, or the same. And you're in your old survival mechanism. And we all know the difference, right, between when we're surviving and in survival mode versus when we're thriving and feeling good and centered and present. And being aware of just being able to have the courage to say, I'm not in the center of my river anymore. I'm not sure how I got off center, but I'm on one bank or the other. That already, and then to notice what's happening, what you're feeling in your body, where you might feel a tightening. Be curious about what happens to your breath. And take some big, deep breaths as a way to calm. And, when we're in that old survival pattern, part of why we keep going down that old rabbit hole is that part of the brain that gets activated is the amygdala. And what happens literally is the prefrontal cortex goes offline, which means our ability to reason and executive functioning goes offline. And I look at breath, intentional breathing, just slow, big, deep breaths, as a way to get our prefrontal cortex back online so that we can then see, because we can then have an ability to be able to see, I'm having an overreaction. And there's one other point I was going to make. It'll come back to me.
Sure. So it is that it's the ability for us to be cognizant when we are in survival mode. We can generally feel it. Our minds are racing. We might be ruminating, overthinking, painting worst case scenarios. We're mind reading or black and white thinking, what have you.
Yeah.
But it's just that, as you said, we find ourselves on one of the banks of this metaphorical river. We may not know what it is, and maybe it doesn't really matter what the trigger was, but the present moment is I am on one of these sides of the river, and it's pushing me into some level of survival mode. And what I hear you saying that is that if I can become cognizant that I'm there, then I can use breath work or breath protocols to move from, as you said, what did you say, from survival to thriving, or from survival mindset to thriving mindsets. So could we speak a little to that breathing? Because, many people speak to breath protocols and such, but sometimes we don't always get down into sort of the nitty gritty of how that shows up and how we can use it.
Perfect. Yeah. So the point I was going to make before leads into this, right?
Okay.
So when we can have a knowing of our bodies, then they become our best biofeedback loop that we have. And so it's knowing the difference of when you were talking about, some people do, right? Our hearts start racing or mind starts going, and the breath can balance the nervous system. And without getting too scientific, there's the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, and there's the parasympathetic nervous system that can, when it's out of balance, right, can be a bit like lack of energy, right? It's ideally that's rest and digest, right? And ideally, the sympathetic is about energy. And so when our nervous system is balanced, we have this calm and alert state that we're in, which actually is another way of saying the flow of the river in my
vernacular.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so the autonomic nervous system, using sort of more layman terms, fight, flight, and the rest digest. When both of these parts of the nervous systems are balanced, we are calm and alert. And on this metaphorical river, we're in this flow state, and that can get us unstuck. So by breathing, by using conscious breath, we can rebalance our nervous system. So if it's the parasympathetic, then we might feel a little deflated, a little depressed. We can increase our breath to sort of activate the sympathetic, or if we're too jacked up with the sympathetic to fight or flight, we can slow down. Because as I understand breath is like when I breathe in, that activates the sympathetic. When I breathe out, that activates the parasympathetic. But if my breathing is equal, both inhale and exhale, let's say for 3 seconds inhale, 3 seconds exhale, then this recalibrates the autonomic nervous system through this breath work, in a sense?
Yeah.
Or am I oversimplifying this?
No, yes, and right. So, because I think this is so important to me, the breath, our breath, and knowing how to use it is one of the most powerful tools we have as humans. So, breathing a little quicker into your upper chest through your mouth, like that, stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. And those slow, deep inhales and a slower exhale than the inhale stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. And so it's knowing, what do I need? Do I need more energy? Or do I need more relaxing so that I can come back home inside? And I think, to really simplify, I think most of us in the society we live in could use to begin with, more of those slow through your nose inhales, and like an exhale, as if you're saying slowly, which engages the parasympathetic nervous system. And I think once we have the calm, we have a better ability to create more energy.
That's fascinating. So through breath work, it's a powerful technique to, if we're feeling flat, to energize ourselves. If we're feeling overstimulated, it's a great way to calm ourselves down. And we can play with breath. We can try different routines or protocols to bring us into the state that we want to or wish to be in. Is that what I understand?
Exactly. Yes.
Great.
And then,
Oh
so
yeah.
we need to do that, right? And then kind of look back at, and be curious, to go back to what we were speaking about. What happened that caused me to have that overreaction?
Mm.
Once we get ourselves back a little bit calmer in our prefrontal cortex, our ability to look and ask questions, it's to be able to sit with whatever that feeling was that we felt like we, or unconsciously really, couldn't feel like we could tolerate feeling.
In part one of my interview with Beth Bardovi, we explored the key theme of resilience, particularly through the lens of her work as a somatic psychotherapist. Now, Beth emphasized the importance of integrating the body and breath alongside emotions to build resilience. We touched on how relationships and parental presence deeply influence the child's emotional development. Both Beth and I agreed that misattunement between parents and children can lead to coping mechanisms and emotional confusion, suggesting that parental education on child rearing could be highly beneficial. We also highlighted authenticity and understanding as anchors for children. We then shifted into discussing self-attunement, where Beth explained that it involves being compassionate toward one's inner experiences, including fears of loss or being overwhelmed. Now, as Beth explained, self-attunement is the ability to tune in to know what your own inner experience is, and to also to have compassion when we are not at our best. Of course, in order to have self-attunement, we need to have self-awareness, and Beth used the analogy of a river, where if we find ourselves in the center of this river, then we are in flow. Now, she also described one bank of the river being the fear of loss, and loss could be that feeling that a child doesn't feel heard or seen, or a parent's preoccupied with something else. Now, the other bank is where we can feel smothered or inundated, where a child can feel overly controlled, where they feel they've lost a sense of agency and autonomy. And these patterns, they follow us into adulthood. And that's why self-awareness and self-attunement is about touching base with our physiology, touching base with our bodies. Because as Beth said, the body knows, the physiology knows what's going on before the psychology does. And so these inner experiences, including fears of loss or being overwhelmed, well, these can stem from our unmet needs, such as attention and validation. And recognizing and addressing these fears, well, it's key to self-awareness and growth. We also dove into understanding triggers, with Beth sharing an insightful example from her practice, and we both emphasized the courage and curiosity needed to recognize behavioral patterns. Finally, we discussed how intentional breathing can help manage stress, allowing us to shift from survival to thriving by balancing the nervous system and using breath to regulate our state, physiologically and psychologically. Now, this conversation laid a foundation for understanding resilience on a deeper, more somatic level. And so now let's slip back into the stream with part two of my conversation with Beth Bardovi. Our emotions are a gateway into how we're thinking, how we're obviously feeling physiologically. I read somewhere, I can't remember what specific paper, but you mentioned that the body is a container for emotional experiences and that these are stored in our tissues. Like for me, emotions are always are the end stop of an actual experience. They are the stamp or a physiological stamp of an experience we've had. I was wondering, could you kindly elaborate on that our emotions are stored in our tissues?
Yes. I guess a simple way to say that is, for every insight we have, right, we have a place in our body that we feel it. And So knowing, so we have body memories, right? Just like we have a memory in our brain. If we think about an experience and we let ourselves stay connected to that experience and we speak from that experience, we will feel the emotions that are attached to that experience. It can be something that was exciting, it can be something that was painful, or anywhere in between, because it lives in our body. And when I'm working with people and we're looking and feeling old holding patterns, I actually really like laser in, where do you feel that in your body? And then by being able to ride that wave of emotion, and most emotions, maybe last 90 seconds.
Okay.
Right? And so if we can ride that wave of what we're feeling and really let ourselves feel it, our body, and then take some breaths, our body starts to, like, you can feel the energy moving down and through. And that's how we can release old trauma, like these old feelings that get stored in our body. We all have holding patterns. And when we can start to let go, we literally can create more space. Our interior world starts to feel more spacious, which again is that flow in the center of the river.
So it's feeling more spacious because we're allowing. Okay, sorry. Okay, let me rewind back here, because I'm fascinated by this chain of reasoning you have, because it resonates so much with me. So someone comes into you, works with you, they're feeling some sort of motion. So you ask them for a physical location on their body where they might feel it. So if it's something like something heavy, they might point to their guts, or if it's something that's really scary or anxiety, they may point to their chest or something, right? So they point to that. They point to the emotion. The emotion lasts for about 90 seconds. And then to some extent, you take them through some sort of breathing protocol to either calm them down or excite them, or to rebalance, to quiet down the amygdala, bring on the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. And when they are in a sort of a buoyant mindset, then they stabilize, per se. Their autonomic nervous system stabilize. Then, Beth, you ask them more sort of exploratory questions about, well, is it after the breathing protocols, this almost physical sensation of space increases? I was wondering if you could just fill in the gaps in my logic here.
You're doing a great job of following.
I'm trying at least.
And I appreciate your resonance and excitement with this.
I'm really curious.
It points out to me, I left out a really big piece, right? So part of where that healing is, right, is I stay in my own regulated nervous system, right, and really tune in to the person I'm working with, right? And so that's already a corrective experience for people, which gives them the ability, right, to find that courage to say, okay, I can speak from, as opposed to talking about something. And there's an energetic difference, right? When somebody is talking about something, it kind of sounds like blah, 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 right? Starts to not have a lot of emotion to it, which isn't a bad thing. It's just that they're cut off from their feelings. But when they can really just stay, oh, you know what? I feel like this tightening here in my chest. And sometimes I might say, oh, just put your hand on your chest. And just take a breath there and see what you feel. And then whatever comes up. It's different for everybody and a different place for everybody, right? And then they can speak, and then that's the younger part of themselves, right? Whatever age is being remembered.
Yeah.
And that is the corrective experience. And then what starts to happen is that holding starts to let go, right? And depending on where they are in their own journey, right? Whether the compassion and understanding comes from me, or they have an understanding of that pattern because we looked at it before, then they can, oh yeah, that's because of when I was little, such and such. And then that starts, literally, the holding starts to let go. And when the energy starts to move downward, that's the release of old trauma.
Yeah.
When people have energy and they can feel it, like it starts in their chest, but it starts to go up and they start to have racing thoughts, like you said earlier. That's the old injury. That's like the trauma, whether it's a big trauma or a little trauma, the injury, right? That's the protective mechanism that served that little child well. It doesn't really serve an adult so well.
Because the world's moved on, he or she's moved on, but that old pattern was for a specific, whatever pattern of relationship that they had that created that mild or severe trauma. And it's just not working anymore.
Right, because that child couldn't literally get out of that injurious feeling, right? They felt like coming at them. But it's never helpful to have a 4-year-old go to the office with an adult and doing your job and responding and reacting.
Good luck with that. Yeah. Yeah, sure. So when they feel this release, when the energy moves downwards and can releases and creates space, is this almost a physiological release of the trauma, mild or severe, what have you, from the tissues? I mean, does it almost unlock and let go? Is it always going to be in some flavor or some sort of shade of that past, will always be part of their history? Or can some people actually just be rid of it all? From my experience, I've never encountered that myself. From my clinical, well, like where a person is like 100% over their trauma, they may have made sense of it or anything, but it has always shaped and will always be part of who they are. Again, I speak anecdotally. I was just wondering, from your experience, have you ever experienced that yourself?
Mm-mm. No, but I think what happens is that people start to believe that their survival strategies are who they are. But that essence of who we are, and the word isn't important, whether people call it soul, spirit, essence, core self, but it's that energy, right, that newborn babies come in with, right? We all come in with this awe and magic, mystery of life. That always stays, but our survival strategies get overlaid. So as we start to understand our survival strategies and what caused the injuries that made them necessary, and I always think it's really important to honor. They were, like we needed them, right? And so it's important to honor that they helped us through life. But as we start to understand and live from a less reactive place, a less protected place, we have more access to who we are authentically. And I think something, the stars align, just right or wrong, however you want to call that. We all have that ability, no matter how much work we've done on ourselves, no matter how much understanding we have, to be triggered by something. But that happens usually with less frequency. And then again, when it happens, if we've been in the center of the river, our center gets stronger. And then, oh, I'm not feeling in my flow anymore. Something happened. And then that's our body's innate wisdom to be able to say, okay, so let me look at what happened. What do I need? Because most of us have the ability to, once we know what we need and how to take care of that younger, more vulnerable part of ourselves from a loving state, to increase our resilience. And then we're less in need looking outwardly in an attempt to get those needs met. And that gives us the power then to be able to choose from a place of want and desire who we spend our time with. And mostly how we spend the time with ourselves.
So obviously self-awareness allows us to attune to ourselves, to understand where we are on the banks of the river or if we're in flow. And we can use breath work to find some sort of respite in our autonomic nervous system. But that would also speak to, we also will want the ability to show self-compassion. And many of us, we show compassion for all those around us, but when it comes to ourselves, it's almost like a boot in the head. We turn off that faucet of compassion for ourselves. If I may ask, Beth, how do you encourage people? How do you teach them to be more compassionate to themselves so they can learn from their experience and not just constantly flagellate themselves based on their experience?
Well, I co-wrote a book called The Secret to Loving Yourself, Profound Little Messages to Change Your Life. And in there's some real concrete steps, right? But so the first is to start to get an awareness of what of the energetic feeling tones that an ideal parent would give their child. And I don't know, sampling are, I love you, I want you, you're special to me. It's not what you do, it's who you are that I love. And so to start to listen for what you said, like how we give compassion to others, but to start to really hear how you speak to yourself. And is that voice a critical voice, a compassionate and loving voice? And when it's a critical voice, that's usually a sign of what we took in from the outside. And how we continue to keep that voice alive. And that's the first place people could really just start to ask themselves, how am I speaking to myself? When I make a mistake, am I, beating myself up, or am I saying, oh, that's okay. You can learn and, maybe you can do a redo or whatever is true, right? It's like truth lands inside of us, right? Like when you, go ahead.
No, I just think that's so important. The self-awareness will allow us to pick up if we're talking to ourselves with a overly critical voice or a compassionate voice. And what I find a lot of the times when people are aware of the narrative going through them, because as we know, from head to heart to hand, the thought triggers emotions, which triggers the behavior, the attitude, or what have you. But if someone is able to rewind, understand the narrative, step back, and actually see what they're scribing on the page, which we call what we're ascribing meaning to whatever situation, well, a lot of the times that person may not have to relearn anything. They could probably learn from other aspects of their lives. When they're compassionate to their children, when they're compassionate to their friends or their families or colleagues, how do you speak to them? Because you don't have to relearn or learn anything new. Maybe just take that slice of yourself where you do show compassion and just change the pronouns per se, or just substitute your name instead of the other person's name. That's what I find that's a very eloquent or elegant way to kind of bridge into self-compassion. As you said, I think it's so profound what you said. It's simple, but there's a deep elegance to what you said between the critical and the compassionate voice.
Yes, and always be curious about what you feel in your body and notice where that holding starts to come in. Because I know I said this earlier, but I think it bears repeating. We respond in our bodies first. Like if somebody asks me to do something, I'll just use myself as an example. And I know that I can't say yes because it's really a no. And I can feel a tightening in my chest. If I'm about to say yes when it's a no, my chest will tighten. And and I've learned to trust that specific kind of tightening that I've discovered inside myself as I can't say yes. And so when we can feel in our bodies and listen, right, to what our bodies are saying, that actually happens before the thought comes out. And to really make an impact and a change, the body piece is just so crucial. So crucial.
So I think you talked about from the trailhead of this conversation, the body knows, or the physiology knows before the psychology knows. And so it's maybe reading or putting your ears to the ground, in a sense, metaphorically, to pick up those signals from our body. So if there is a tense or a tightening or something, there's a dis-ease, there's something that feels off kilter, not right, then that's telling you that don't go down that road, or at least not right now. And by doing that, by listening to our physiology, by listening to our body, which knows before our psychology, that can give us a huge advantage, a heads up, per se, as how to approach or engage or disengage with a situation.
Exactly. And part of the trickiness to it is if we do listen to our body and we speak our truth, more often than not, right, things work. But we don't get a reinforcement back because we just feel good. But when we don't listen to that voice inside that knows, and something goes wrong, I should have listened. So the reinforcement, when we can pay attention, doesn't necessarily come because we're just swimming in our river in the center.
Just to challenge you, if you don't mind, Beth, like if someone sits there and they listen to their physiology, they listen to their body before making a cognitive decision about something, and they pick up a sense of fear or anxiety, how can that person tell the difference between a genuine fear or an irrational fear, if we can just use fear as a vehicle here? I mean, how maybe my body's reacting, based on making a paper tiger into a tiger, right? And like, how would the layman, the lay person, know the difference between what is genuine and what is just maybe irrational fear based?
That's a great question. I think the best way I know how to answer that is to do a 0 to 10 reality check, right? 10 is the equivalent of death. How much danger am I in? Is the tiger really coming in? And what's the number? 0 to 10. And for most often, it's a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 0. And if it's a 10, we really need to know that so that we could take action to protect ourselves.
I really like that, because what you're suggesting is that, okay, you have this feeling, this fear or anxiety, Jason, you feel it, but you're saying, since emotions can be very subjective, put an objective number on that subjective feeling. So if it is 10, then more than likely it is the tiger and blood on its talons and its claws and its teeth. But if it's like a 2 or 3, maybe you need to do a deeper reality check. And then that in itself, putting an objective number on a subjective feeling, then I could ask myself, okay, I'm feeling a 5 right now, but what could I do to bring it down to a 4? So that almost gives me a sense of agency, a sense of self-efficacy that I can maybe take it down a little. Is that what I understand?
Most people, right, can see is in that 0 to 10 current reality, I'm really 5 and under. It's really, and most people will tell me it's a 1 or a 2.
Okay.
And just being able to name, oh, this is a 2, that calms. And as soon as we start to calm ourselves, then we can start to reason. But before the calming, all we can do is respond to the old, what felt to our nervous system imminent death from that state. So by calming ourselves, we can respond more appropriately and most of us then can do what we need to do.
They're very powerful and pragmatic tools you're speaking of, and the knowledge, because it's so applicable in the day-to-day, in the moment. It's just we need to practice it. And maybe it doesn't always have to be when we're in crisis or red flag mode. Maybe when we're in a good state, when things are really going well, maybe just check in with yourself. How's your body responding to this? What are the signals you're picking up, right? I guess it doesn't always have to be in crisis mode. We can do it in almost any emotional state. Just to practice it.
It's a practice, and the more we practice, the easier it is. And so you make a good point, Jason, because if you just check in, oh, I'm feeling good. Oh, wow, I'm feeling good. That anchors that in and strengthens that experience. Oh, I'm in my flow, which gives us a better ability when we're not feeling good to be able to put that into practice when we most need it.
I was wondering if we could just shift. You wrote a second book, and it just came out recently. I think it's My Love is for Always: Profound Little Messages to Grow a Resilient Child. Now, many listeners on this podcast may have children. What advice or words of wisdoms or practices could you share with our listeners to create or to help develop more resilient children, children with more resilient mindsets?
Yeah, that book came from my heart and my passion, because I realized that, well, what I thought could happen and what I've gotten some feedback that it does work is that so that book has like 15 different ideal feeling tones. Feeling tones that an ideal parent would give to their children. And it's in verse form so that it really just creates a feeling. And my thought was, if a parent could read, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, just a loved adult who loves a child, or even to our own children inside of ourselves. But this was really written to be read to children, that in the reading of it, if a parent could just read the words, right, authentically, that energetic message would get transmitted into their children, which would give their children greater resiliency. And I was working with somebody who was having difficulty really attaching with her 4-year-old daughter at the time. Okay. And I said, read this book to her. Just read it with feeling. And she did. And 3-4 weeks later, her little girl said to her, "Mommy, do you love me?" And her mommy said, "I do." And her daughter said, I know, because the book told me so. And it's like,
Wow.
yeah, right?
Hmm.
And so really children are near and dear to my heart. I started out child development, preschool teacher when I was in college. And so that book just really, it means so much to me, because if we can raise resilient children, like, this world coming up could be such an amazing place to be in.
I think that's what we need. I mean, there needs, again, from my perspective, I think there needs to be more robust and resilient mindsets in our children, because sometimes I look around at maybe the latest generation, and it's not all on their shoulders, their fault, but there's almost a fragility or brittleness sometimes to some of them. When I think back to my grandfather's generation, the great, he grew up in the First World War, and this is in Britain, and then the Great Depression hits, and then just when he's in his prime, he has sent off to war. And I'm thinking, when I talked to, he's passed a long time ago, but when I talked to my grandfather when I was a child, and I reflect on those conversations, it's just the resilience and the mindset. I'm not saying they were perfect, far from it. I mean, there was a lot of problems, but the robustness of that mindset of that generation, it truly astounds me. And I think books like yours, where a parent, as you said, they can speak from their heart. They can speak genuinely and sincerely and deeply, and read these passages, because it's been well thought of through yourself and your co-author, in a way, from experience and knowledge as a child psychologist, working, I think you said 4 decades per se, and that's your passion. I mean, talk about instilling a great pattern. I mean, talking about, psychosocially, emotionally intelligent children, evolving into adults. I mean, that's a great picture for a future society, for any society. So I just want to give you kudos where kudos are earned.
Thank you, Jason. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
We are coming close to the top of the hour. I was wondering, are there any last thoughts you would like, or wisdoms or ideas you'd like to leave with our listeners today, Beth?
Mm. I think really, like, the power of knowing that it's an inside job, right? It kind of relates to your title, but we have the ability to, through self-attunement and self-discovery and self-compassion, to find that loving state that we come into the world with. And just like that essence, those bright eyes and bright souls. And I think it's quite powerful, because we don't need anybody else really to get there. I mean, sometimes it's helpful to have a guide. And once we know what our patterns are, it's just all about us, right? And in finding that bravery to make a different choice, a more self-serving choice. And I think it does take a lot of courage and bravery to be able to be vulnerable.
Well, thank you, Beth, very much for such a marvelous and insightful conversation. My brain's percolating right now. I have to take some of these thoughts and write them down. I really appreciate your time and sharing your passion and your knowledge and experience with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, Jason.
Pretty much this whole episode was a deep dive into the theme of resilience. We focused on the connection between body awareness, emotional regulation, and self-attunement. One thing Beth emphasizes is how important it is to work with the body and breath, especially when it comes to managing stress and shifting from a survival to a more thriving mindset. We also talked about the impact of early relationships, parenting, and how misattunement can lead to emotional confusion in kids. Beth talked about being authentic, present, and attuned with our children, and it's crucial for their emotional development. And another big theme was the idea of understanding our survival strategies and how past experience can shape our behavior today. Beth really shed a lot of light on how emotions, trauma, and physical sensations are all interconnected, and how recognizing these patterns can help us move toward living more authentically. Beth, a personal thank you from me to you for spending some time with me today, and thank you very much for sharing your deep knowledge and experience over 40 years of psychotherapy. I thought it was a really brilliant conversation, so thanks again. And remember, if you want to learn more, there's always the show notes, the episode show notes, and there's also a transcript available. You'll also find the links to the books she co-wrote with her co-author, Margie Gale. The first one is The Secret to Loving Yourself, Profound Little Message to Change Your Life. And the second book was My Love is for Always, Profound Little Messages to Grow a Resilient Child. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode because I found it enlightening and fascinating. And just before we wrap up this episode, just a little call to action. If you could take the time, if you could rate and subscribe to the podcast, and also if you could recommend it to 2 friends, 2 family members, 2 colleagues, because the hardest thing with all these kind of podcasts is growing listenership. So I'd really appreciate that if you enjoy the content of this podcast. Well, we are coming close to the tail end of this episode. So for those of you, I will meet some of you on Bite Size Fridays this coming Friday, where we explore an archived episode. And if not, I will see you for our long-form discussions with a fresh new guest next Monday. Well, folks, until then, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.